I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Carle, a retired CIA officer and a rather cerebral chap. He's the author of The Interrogator and a fantastic geopolitical analyst. In the next hour, the two of us, the Rajput and the Wasp, will make sense of the three most important developments of the month. In short, we'll make sense of the world, as we do in our podcast, The Dialectic, which you can listen to on any platform you want, and our website too. Without further ado, our top three choices for October are: number one, Russian escalation, obviously, of the war. Number two, Emperor Xi Jinping, and the entire kabuki drama, as Glenn calls it, surrounding it. And Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, a first person of color to ascend to the top position. He has made his way up the Greece poll, emulated Benjamin Disraeli, and we'll examine what his rise means and contrast it with some other places in the world. Without further ado, now let's get cracking about the Russian escalation of the Ukraine war. Russia has conducted a nuclear weapons drill, its first nuclear weapons drill since its invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps more scarily, or equally scarily, if not more scarily, it has knocked out, or it has been knocking off, Ukraine's power grid. Primary targets have been electrical substations that link different parts of Ukraine's grid together. Some of these substations have been hit by as many as 10 missiles. The Russian goal seems to be to chop up the grid system into pieces so that power cannot be moved between different regions of the country to balance the load, which means the Ukrainian grid itself might shut down, which is a scary prospect in the Ukrainian winter. This could be tragic, and this could lead to an exodus of millions trudging through the snow to get to warmer places, or relatively warmer places, or places with heating, such as Germany and Poland, and might create strains outside Ukraine as well. So Glenn, take us through what's going on in the war and walk us through the implications.
I learned hello everybody. I learned in some ways, terrible lesson now many years ago when I was first becoming involved actually as a negotiator. I had thought, growing up in this idealized and therefore unreal world of late 1950s and 1960s upper middle class America, that if you negotiated an agreement or you had a difference of opinion and there was some political process involved, that when there would be some sort of a compromise, and then people would respect the agreement. And of course, that is completely foolish. I found that there is actually no reason whatsoever one party in a negotiation should ever stop or will ever stop pursuing its objectives under any circumstance at all times, even if forced to make concessions. This was powerfully brought home to me in the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein, although his forces were annihilated in 4 days and was completely at the mercy of whatever President Bush decided to do, nonetheless continued to pursue his objectives to the limit of his abilities. And I realized, well, of course he would. Why would he not? Those are his objectives, until he was constrained. And then there's a cost-benefit analysis, to put it coldly. And he or anyone in negotiation or in a test of wills and power would concede to the margin of what he could had to agree to. So the war will be decided in Vladimir Putin's brain. And that's an alarming place to be, because he is quite consistent. Atul and I have argued for years that he is a cynic, but he is also consistent in his beliefs, which are that Ukraine is a subordinate, at most a subordinate part of the Russian sphere of influence and empire. Ukrainians are an artificial people, and even if they aren't, that's irrelevant, because they should be subject to Moscow. And that's what he will pursue unless he is absolutely obliged to change his policies. There are some facts on the ground that are obliging him to not concede anything, but to no longer exercise his sovereignty or influence where his military can no longer control territory. But short of that, the situation remains, frankly, dire and will continue to accelerate. I don't place much significance on the nuclear weapons drill. This is a standard step, and it has the effect of alarming people, which is a good thing if you're Russian, while being routine and not really changing the West or to Russia. But I also see that Putin has no way out. I continue to be, and I think most all of us were, including intelligence services, governments, Atul and I, a bit surprised consistently through this war that the quote exit ramps or ways to declare victory, success points that were carefully put in or not closed off, at least by the West, have been irrelevant to Putin because he's consistent in his objectives. The danger is that he will continue to accelerate. Term slips my mind. Increase pressure, given his progressively limited options for exercising pressure, to touch upon, and I'll stop in just a second or two, destroying, as he could do, destroying the energy grid for Ukraine, which would be a substantial escalation, wouldn't lead him to victory directly, but could create such chaos that it may give him openings.
So, Glenn, there's one way to look at it is that Russia attacked Kyiv, and its tanks were found wanting. Its armored personal carriers were found wanting. Cheap missiles and cheap drones, NLAWs, for instance, from the UK, and of course American missiles, Javelins, which cost a fraction of a tank, were able to decimate the flower of Russian forces. All of that is true, but thereafter Russia has avoided major casualties in a way. Russia has taken over much of the east. Russia has a large part of the coast. Russia is still in a better position territorially if the war ends today than it was on February 24th. And the Ukrainians, for all their bravery, for all their extraordinary war effort, are left with a truncated, or to use words from history, a moth-eaten country. And the Ukrainians especially face the prospects of a dire winter. So in this war, Russia may seem to be suffering, but the real tragedy is happening in Ukraine. And the big question mark is, how long can Ukraine keep standing in this slugfest, which this war has become? And winter is fast approaching, and it'll get very, very, very ugly now.
Well, I think there are two factors there. One is the will, and one is the means. Your comments lead most directly to the issue of means. So long as the means for continued resistance or combat or offensive operations exist, then then the war will continue from Ukraine's side. And that gets to really Washington and our political process here in the United States more than in Kyiv's. The other is the will. And, I haven't been to Ukraine for 36 years or some such thing. I don't know. But by all indications from every media outlet that one can follow, taking anecdotal soundings and more formal polls of the Ukrainian public and the cohesion of the government, they are uniform in their assessments, which is that almost to the last Ukrainian, the Ukrainians are determined to oppose Russia and to triumph. And we have found it's a repeated mistake that militaries or governments make, which is to think that one can cow an opponent. The Allies made the mistake by this, quote, strategic bombing campaign. And the polling at the time by the UK, by the British, and by the Americans during the war was that the bombing, there was a direct correlation between increasing bombing and destruction and increasing the will of the German people to resist the Allies. That's been the same thing was the case in Vietnam, and the same is in Ukraine. So a matter of will, I'm not concerned about there. Yeah. What might affect the will more would be the destruction of the electric grid and social problems then.
That has never been the question in this war. The Ukrainians have proved themselves to be more motivated, to be braver, to be better trained, to have higher morale, and all in all, to have a better fighting force than Russia. The big question is, do they have the means? Can they take the casualties? Can they support the war with a broken economy? Can they keep their people warm and alive through the winter? And can they feed their people eventually? Because if all infrastructure or a lot of it is torn up, and if railways, ports, roads, all of them are ripped apart, then the big question is, yes, they have the will to fight, but will they have the means to fight? And that is the operative question, really.
Right. And there the answer will be given mostly in Washington and other Western capitals. Berlin, I think, is the second most important one, rather than in Kyiv. The Allies and the Soviets destroyed literally 1 building in 3 in all of Germany during World War II, and absolutely annihilated or attempted to the productive capacity of Germany. Nonetheless, German productive capacity, I talked about the will, but their productive capacity continued to rise until late 1944, I think it was, which was only 6 months before the end of the war. So I'm less concerned about Ukraine's will and capacity, even if they have no electricity, so long as they have the means. And that gets to, for me, the issues which are the critical ones from Ukraine's side or the Allied side of NATO and EU solidarity. And that's a function of the economic strains, first and foremost, derived from energy shortages and the readjustment of the energy industry in Europe in particular. And trends are moving in the right direction of replacing supplies and generating indigenous, I'll call it, West European capacity for natural gas and so on. Whether they're fast enough to retain cohesion and support, I think is the critical question.
So let's get to energy. OPEC Plus has cut production. We had an article by Matthew Hedges just a few days ago, which talks about the GCC now firmly moving towards Russia and away from the US. The Gulf is also closer to China because China imports a lot of energy. The US doesn't anymore. And the interests of the Gulf are in cutting production, because that means oil prices go up, that means oil producers profit, and we are back to 1973 in a way. In a way, this cutting of oil production in combination with all the other commodity shocks and the huge buildup of debt, which has preceded this crisis, which goes back actually before 2007, 2008, and then the stimulus afterwards, and then afterwards, the COVID fiscal stimulus, and at the same time, there was monetary easing all the time. So we've had a period of dangerous debt buildup, then a commodity shock from Russia, which includes not just oil, but gas and coal and nickel, and we've gone through it before. I mean, all sorts of stuff. And of course, now we have the OPEC plus shock. So as Nouriel Roubini, who's known as Dr. Doom, is he right that we are now going to see the mother of all stagflations? And once that happens, then we have a winter of discontent, and citizens and electorates might rebel. In Italy already, we've seen Mario Draghi, an economist, a former Goldman Sachs employee, the former head of the European Central Bank, shown the door. And Giorgia Meloni, a far-right lady with rumored links to Moscow, is in charge. So things are not as clear-cut. This winter, it could turn out to be an iconic one.
Well, I'm afraid that you might be correct. I don't know. I certainly agree that the U.S. has been for almost 15 years, a decade anyway, even with the even including President Trump's radically different approach to the Middle East than Obama's or Biden's. The U.S. has downgraded the Middle East, meaning Saudi Arabia, as a strategic, because the United States is the world's largest fossil fuel producer and can be an exporter, and doesn't rely on Saudi Arabia existentially as it did before. It remains important for any number of...
With cheap natural gas, you have a huge manufacturing advantage, which is why a lot of industry is coming back to the US.
Right.
Energy costs are simply too high in Japan, too high in Western Europe, and even China pays a very high price for energy.
Right, and what's always been called the Arab-Israeli, which is really a Muslim-Jewish central defining issue in the Middle East, is no longer existential. It hasn't been for many years. Israel is not existentially threatened. Something that Trump succeeded in doing
through the Abraham Accords. Now
tools that I wouldn't agree upon, but nonetheless is consequential in I think a beneficial way, is yet deeper agreements and settling of peace between Muslim and the states and the Jewish state. And so the Middle East is less critically important. It remains so for a host of reasons. But Saudi Arabia is piqued about this and is playing the card it can play, and will remain critically important globally, because even no matter what anyone does, fossil fuels will remain critical for the next 40 years anyway.
And so that brings us to a very simple point, that you once said economics is destiny in the context of Solomon Islands siding with China. And if economics is destiny, then China is importing a lot of Saudi oil. So is India. So the center of gravity of Saudi Arabia is bound to shift east.
Absolutely.
And Saudi Arabia's interests lie with Russia, because higher energy prices, higher oil prices are good for both Russia and for Saudi Arabia. So in that case, Russia itself may be a small economy, maybe the size of Belgium in terms of its GDP, but it has an asymmetric effect on the global economy. And the cohesion of NATO that you talk about as being so important, the cohesion of EU, solidarity within the EU, which you talk about as so important, could be threatened. In fact, if the Republicans were to win, even one of the two houses of the US Congress, we would be seeing something very, very, very different come October. So what we are seeing really is a huge strain on the global economy, a huge escalation of violence in Ukraine, and in some ways, the perfect storm this winter.
Now, there is a different way to look at it. I would say positive, but at least a different way. And I think what you said and what I'm going to say or have said are simultaneously true. And I don't think the future is won or decided.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the great issues in play. The Japanese government has just announced it's sort of they took the decision in 2018, but they're enhancing or accelerating their focus on it to reinvigorate the Japanese nuclear industry. Now, why? Largely because of the invasion of Ukraine and the critical vulnerability that Japan, of all countries, has on importing energy. 88% of their energy all energy needs must be imported, and that really means fossil fuels. So the only way to address that, to address the pressure on the yen, to address the pressure on of inflation, to develop some measure of independence, frankly, is at hand, is to rapidly increase once again the generation of nuclear power. Similarly, they are focusing heavily on renewables, but nuclear power. Similarly, not with nuclear power necessarily, Europe and the United States have increased natural gas exports from the United States to Europe by, I think, 5-fold in the past 7 months. And the gas imports from Russia, because of decisions that both Europe has taken and Russia has taken, have dropped from 80% of the need down to 10 or 12%. I forget exactly, but there's something to that effect of Europe's gas needs. Now, these are short-term things that are great strains, but they also, I think, mean that the Europe in particular and the international system strained by the Ukraine war and energy stresses that we were talking about in Saudi Arabia and so on, are in a race to, can Germany and Denmark and the United States build natural gas facilities fast enough to compensate? Can Japan regenerate nuclear power quick enough to avoid sort of breaking the system? I think the answer can be yes, but it may not be. If it's not, then the scenario you describe, Atul, alarmingly, will come to pass. And if they do, then Saudi Arabia and Russia will probably become closer, as you say. The power will shift. China will need fossil fuels. They will remain fossil fuels important for decades, but the world will shift dramatically if these changes can happen faster than the stresses break things.
Excellent. Talking about change, there have been changes in China too. We have the coronation of Emperor Xi Jinping. He was appointed for a third 5-year term. He kicked out Li Keqiang and Wang Yang. Apparently, he's retired Li Jianxi and Hang Zhang. And more importantly, as my Chinese friends tell me, he has smashed all the post-Deng Xiaoping era precedents. After Deng in China, there was a collective consensus within the Chinese Communist Party that there would be no personality cults. There would be collective leadership. There would be some sort of informal balancing of factions. And the new Politburo that she has announced is basically stuffed with his loyalists. Interestingly, he's also humiliated Hu Jintao, the rumor mills have gone into overdrive, surmising what went on and who probably opened his file before he was supposed to. It is, as you say, kabuki theater, which of course is Japanese, but it applies in this case to the Chinese situation. Needless to say, the venerable old former president was escorted out of the hall, making his humiliation very public. Everyone else, of course, sat impassively. And just as the two houses of Congress offer their own theater in terms of people speaking to empty halls and speaking to camera with no debate or discussion. Of course, I mean the US houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. In China, there is a different display, which is a marionette-like, opaque, almost all men deciding upon the future of the country in wonderful Chinese jargon or CCP jargon. And so what does this mean, this new development mean, A, for Taiwan, and B, in the light of, and we've just been discussing this in detail, in the light of the US choking off China's access to the future of AI. This went largely unnoticed. It was covered by, to be fair, by a Financial Times chap and by Neil Ferguson in his article, which is very interesting, which is which I have it right here, how Cold War II could turn into World War III, which is an interesting take at this. But we are certainly living in interesting times, and so why don't you crack on? By the way, before you crack on, one last thing. Those of you who are interested in our analysis on Taiwan should listen to our podcast. The last episode was on Taiwan, and our podcast is The Dialectic by Fair Observer. And you can find it on Spotify, you can find it on Apple, you can find it on Google, and you can find it on our website. So I've made the plug. Glenn, the floor is all yours.
Well, that's daunting, but I take a slight malicious pleasure in referring to the 20th Congress as kabuki, because of course the tensions are eternal. But that really was, the French say intronisation. It was the enthronement in a formal sense, but not a substantive one, because the substance had already occurred, of Xi and Xi Jinping thought, such as it is, and of the new ever more centralized, more aggressive, more nationalist, more economically statist China. So in that sense, it's sort of, well, okay, there's no change here. It just formalizes what everyone who's watched China at all has noted or anticipated. But I'm not dismissing the significance of Xi Jinping and what's happening. Xi and China are the great issues of our era. And China will be the progressively driving force, as we all know, I think we all know, long after, unfortunately, I'm dead, which I hope is still many years in the future. But it's the central question. I think, though, really the larger substantive issue, which is, to me, what you touched upon, which is historically consequential and dramatic, is the announcement, the response to Xi's concentration of power and change in the nature of the Chinese state, really, and its interactions with outsiders, with non-Chinese, is the twofold response by the Biden administration. One you touched upon, which is the embargo of or steps to shut down transfer of AI technology, intellectual and physical. to China and to make it, and I can't cite off the top of my head the technical details that make the following a reality. But it isn't just that, oh, the US will no longer invest in or not allow American companies. There are measures taken similar to those that the US has taken against Iran that make a third party unlikely to engage in similar AI research and business with China, because the consequences would be dire.
And I can just give a quick summary. So what the Biden administration has decided to do is, number one, strangle the Chinese AI industry by choking off access to high-end AI chips. Number two, block China from designing, I repeat, designing AI chips domestically by choking off China's access to US-made chip design software. So this is on the design side.
Which remains not just critical, but like 90% of the cutting edge industry is American.
Yeah. Number three, block China from manufacturing advanced chips. Now, I repeat, manufacturing, by choking off access to US-built semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And number four, block China from domestically producing semiconductor manufacturing equipment by choking off access to US-built components. So they won't get the chips, they won't be able to design the chips, they won't be able to manufacture the chips because they won't have the equipment, and they won't be able to manufacture the manufacturing equipment because they will not get US-built components. Now, obviously, China is a country of 1.3 billion. China could come up with all of these technologies itself. If there is enough national will and they throw enough resources, they will find a way. But this puts them back many years, maybe a decade. And this is very much like the US cutting off access to oil in the case of Japan during World War II. So things have just got very, very, very heated.
Oh, very heated. This is it's almost a cutting off the oil in 1941 by Franklin Roosevelt's cutting off all oil imports to China, embargoing all of it, was a casus belli. I mean, now it's not as dramatic, the current situation. China will not cease to function as an economy as a result of these steps, but its cutting edge leadership or approaching leadership has been cut off, at least, as you say, for a decade. Now, it's true, of course, China has millions of brilliant people who, and the Chinese are no fools. They've anticipated this step by President Biden and have been pouring hundreds of billions of dollars and thousands of talented people into these, I'll call it industry. But it will at the very least slow China and put China behind for probably a decade. You can say, well, they will develop therefore their own indigenous production, and that is undoubtedly going to be true. But there is a bit of the argument that infant industries never grow up, and in a sense that because they are obliged to be protectionist de facto, they can't develop as quickly on the margins. And the decisive point is on the margins of development for cutting edge technologies in this instance. But this is only half the story, which is truly historically dramatic, far more consequential than the 20th Congress, which, as we say, was kabuki. That was one half of Biden's approach. The second is the CHIPS bill, which actually had some bipartisan support, shockingly, in the United States. And it's $54 billion that the Biden administration is directing towards exactly these technological developments, research and development and production facilities, so that the United States becomes a manufacturer and a developer in the intellectual sense of the emerging AI technologies. Together, it's a quite coherent, dramatic, strategic approach to the Cold War, to the rivalry with China, which has had for a decade, I would say, under Xi Jinping, a very coherent, sensible, and consequential focus on developing and becoming a world leader, the world leader in AI. These two things will shape the global economy, technology, and rivalry between the two countries. These two steps for a minimum of a decade, so long as Xi Jinping is in power, anyway.
Peter Isaacson, our chief strategy officer, makes a point that AI is really worrying. And if a nation decides to weaponize it, it is likely to become an instrument of power. He says George Orwell might have had an opinion about that. And my response is, of course, AI is an instrument of power. It'll not be an instrument of power. It is. All these facial recognition technologies, all the AI being used in drone strikes, which I'm sure Glenn knows all about, although he cannot talk about it. All these different technologies at play, whether it is fighter jets, whether it is drones, whether it is facial recognition at airports, all of that, all of these new technologies use AI. It's basically, I'm told AI is a fancy word for machine learning. This is what Jan Willem van de Mintu, who's a professor in the field, says. But anyway, the reality is that computers have more and more computing power. Computers can sift through more data. Computers can sift through patterns. Computers are finally beating in, human beings, not just in chess, but also Go. So AI is an instrument of power, and because the US has domination in this field, it is still top dog. It can leverage that domination to exercise power over others. After all, what is Facebook? After all, what is Facebook? After all, what is Google? That is all power in the hands of American companies, and by extension, America.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's no one technology or technique or productive capacity. In the 1970s, America was in turmoil and all worked up because Japan was starting to clearly, was manufacturing technologically and economically superior automobiles. And the automobile industry had been central to the American economy. And they destroyed Detroit. They built better cars for lower cost. But the error that some Americans made was to think that that was decisive for a leadership or for a power perspective. And it wasn't. Cars were in some ways yesterday's news at that point. They were not the cutting edge technologies. Similarly, in the 1880s, Great Britain was the global power, but Germany led the world in the chemical industry, and that led to global power. And the British lagged. And here now in 2020s, the issue is not steel or dyes or manufacturing processes for automobiles. It is nano-sized computer chips and how you make them or what will succeed them. And that will determine who makes, frankly, the better weapons, has richer citizens, higher tax base, and will exercise global leadership.
On that note, I must mention Antoine van Ochtemeil, who's one of our donors, and he was chair of NPR. And Antoine coined the term emerging economies. And then Antoine wrote about smart, not cheap, brain belts, how brain belts are shaping the world. And Antoine's thesis is that increasingly it'll be innovative places in the world that will bring back manufacturing. This will be small scale. This will be a combination of new materials. It'll be a marrying of software and hardware. The chips will play a big role, and it will be a lot of additive manufacturing and a combination of many different technologies. And he gives the example of Akron, Ohio, becoming the polymer capital of the world, Batesville, Mississippi, Eindhoven in the Netherlands, which is apparently the most educated and intelligent place on the planet. And so Antoine's thesis is that we are going to see a massive comeback of manufacturing in Europe, in the US, and the old industries which on which China has bet, and on which, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which is not even on industry but on plain energy, that they are betting on, will soon be passing. Now,
Well,
this may or may not entirely be true. This may not transpire tomorrow, but it is certainly the case that the zeitgeist is changing, and the US continues to be nimble, and it remains to be seen if the Asian giants, although they are rising in power, and they will rise in power, and they will become more powerful, and their per capita income will rise, and the balance of power will shift southeast or east over time. But it remains to be seen whether they can displace the US as top dog.
Right, and they're making, and Xi Jinping is making decisions that are hindering China's future progress. Life has been relatively easy in a certain sense for China from the time of Mao until today, because marginal.
No. I would say from the time of Deng, I would disagree.
Oh, Deng.
In Mao's time, they had the Great Leap Forward. They had the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, no. Only from the time of his death. I mean, Mao was an unmitigated disaster. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Deng,
we totally agree.
Onwards.
But to increase from $100 per annum per capita income to $200 is a 100% increase, but you still are only earning $200, whereas Western Europe is earning $50,000 per capita or something. So the marginal increases will be dramatic, and one can build on existing breakthroughs that you do not yet have on cement technology, chemical technology, or automobile manufacturing processes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's when you reach the margins that progress becomes incremental and minute. And that's where China is now. It has caught up and surpassed in various areas. But now life is a lot harder. And it's only through, and I don't want to sound like a doctrinaire Adam Smith capitalist, I am not, but it's the creative destruction of competition that leads to success. So that 100 kilometers north of where I live is Lowell, or maybe a little more, Lowell, Massachusetts, which pioneered industrial processes in the early 19th century. The American Amos Lowell stole the technology from Great Britain, literally stole it, and brought it home. He went on a grand tour of Europe, and he was not allowed to take any notes of any factory in Great Britain because they were concerned about someone stealing their technological leadership. But he had a good memory, and so he stole the technology, and thus was the textile revolution that generated the wealth in New England, which was totally decrepit by the time I was a kid 130 years later. But what's happened is that New England, which really means Boston economically, has gone through a technological revolution of abandoning what had been passed by and accepting the interweaving dynamism of academia, research, finance, and outside challenge, meaning foreign challenges, and thus has become, with Silicon Valley, the economic leader of AI and technology in the United States. Xi Jinping is doing the opposite. He won't kill the goose that lays the Chinese golden eggs, or maybe the dragon that lays the Chinese golden eggs, but he is hindering it by centralizing control and decisions.
What we know is a day ago, there was a spectacular sell-off in China's markets.
Yeah.
So it is clear that Xi's consolidation of power, his iron fist approach, his iron grip on the economy is not producing great results. The zero COVID policy has led to an unmitigated disaster. It is frankly bloody stupid. And many other actions that he has taken have been extremely Maoist. He comes across as as a reincarnation of Mao. Of course, he doesn't have Mao's charisma. He didn't go through Mao's struggle. But China seems to have gone from Mao to Deng and back to Maoism. And that is a very dangerous place to be, because you're not getting price signals, which a market economy gives you. Yes, you can get a few things right, and you can get things in a certain direction through diktat, as Stalin proved. Stalin did
that a Western democracy, or at least the United States, cannot.
Yeah.
I mean, when you know, my wife, who has traveled to China frequently, comes back with the same reaction that everyone else has. Hers are powerful. And I've had the same reaction when I go to Asia also. Although I haven't gone into Hong Kong, I've been to, but not mainland China. Which is that Americans are complacent, like the British were for many, many years, thinking that we are leading the way and choose the discipline. And in fact, the world has passed the United States by. It is shocking to see the glittering infrastructure of much of Asia.
The Delhi Metro is far superior to New York subway and the Boston Tate. There's no comparison.
Yeah,
it's clean, it's gleaming. So my point was allied to yours, in the sense that yes, there is something to be said for it. You don't want to be too short-termist that you just live in 2-year time cycles. At the same time, you don't want to go down the emperor route, because then when you make a mistake, it could be a fatal mistake, like the sinking of the Titanic. And that is what China seems to be veering towards. It's gone are the days of Deng, gone are the days of lots of inputs and a more intelligent, cohesive policy making. And now it is very much a land yet again of a personality cult. And that, I think, is supremely worrying for the future.
Yes, and the last thing, the last point I'll mention is probably all of you listening will have seen the similar things to what I've seen. I'm not sure, but for all of the monolithic aspect or presentation of China under Xi, there were for 3 decades hundreds of millions of Chinese who embraced to some degree a much more pluralistic set of ideals, economically, politically, and socially. And that there is, not allowed, violently, when necessary, suppressed in China, there is nonetheless substantial disaffectation and hostility towards many of the changes that Xi has imposed. There's no outlet for it, but they're nonetheless, until 2 years ago, I haven't seen data more recent than that, there were literally hundreds of thousands of demonstrations throughout China, mostly for local concerns, because those are the only ones that one could protest without risking one's life. But opposition to the centralizing pressures under Xi, hostility to them. There's sincere, deep, ardent, dangerous nationalism that is widespread, but it is not a monolith. And at some point, pressures might, a pressure cooker either explodes or there's some safety valve, and it is not determined that the Orwellian state will be pure. That in China, no.
Well, speaking of the Orwellian state, let's talk about the land where George Orwell belonged to. He was born in India, of course. Most people forget that. He was born apparently in Motihari. And his father ran an opium estate. They grew opium and they sold it to China. And the British gave starvation to the brown man and brown women, and of course, addiction to the yellow man and yellow women. That's how a lot of fortunes were made, apparently Jardine Fleming amongst them. And ironically, the land of Winston Churchill that didn't look very highly upon brownie fuzzy wuzzies and saw them as surrender monkeys, now has an Indian prime minister. And the chap's name is Rishi Sunak. And Rishi Sunak has many firsts to his name. many firsts to his name. He's the first person of color in the prime ministerial office in 10 Downing Street. He's the first British Indian. He's the first Hindu. He is the first to have worked in finance, the first to have done an MBA, and the first to have worked in none other than Goldman Sachs. So in that sense, he's a bit like Mario Draghi, who's already been Prime Minister of Italy. And so there are lots of firsts about him. But on the one hand, he's very new and fresh. But on the other hand, he's from another angle, he's also an old-fashioned Tory. There's a fascinating article by Adrian, what's his name? Adrian Wooldridge. He used to be in The Economist and is now in Bloomberg. And he talks about Rishi Sunak is a new and old-fashioned Tory. And why is he old-fashioned? Well, he may have a different skin color, but he went to Winchester College, founded by William of Wykeham in 1382. So alumni of Winchester are still called Wykehamists, and so he's a good old-fashioned Wykehamists. After Winchester, he read, because you always read at Oxford, you don't study. He read for a philosophy, politics, and economics degree, PPE. I did that too, but I've appointed, I have not amounted to much in life, and I'm still a disappointment to my tutors and my family. But clearly, Rishi Sunak has done well. He is now Prime Minister. And he went to Lincoln College, University of Oxford, where a dear friend named Adam Irwin read biochemistry. And he became a shining superstar of British politics. He was parachuted into Yorkshire, into William Hague's safe seat. And in the 2016 referendum, he turned into a Brexiteer. He chose Boris Johnson's leadership over David Cameron's leadership. And David Cameron wistfully remarked, if we've lost Rishi, we've lost the future of the party. He was seen as the future of the party by David Cameron, about whom his tutor once remarked that he's extremely clever, but exceedingly mendacious. I repeat, extremely clever, but exceedingly mendacious. So much so for David Cameron, but Rishi's election is historic because you could say it's the Empire Strikes Back. You could say that this is, as Martin Plaut, who's authored an article on Fair Observer, and he authored it a while ago. This is now an era of post-racial politics. Of course, in Ireland, you've had Leo Varadkar. In Portugal, you have Antonio Costa, who's got the overseas citizenship of India. His father was apparently of Goan origin. Same holds true for Leo, and Rishi's election, in some ways, demonstrates that UK has turned a completely new chapter when it comes to race. But some see Rishi very differently, and they have a different view on his significance. Of course, some contrast, and I'll close with this, contrast the UK to Germany. Ethnic minorities in the UK are 14%. And of course, the number of MPs and members of cabinet who come from ethnic minorities are much higher. Ethnic minorities in Germany are 26%, almost double that of the UK, but there's hardly anybody from ethnic minorities in top leadership in Germany. Ethnic minorities in France are actually 16%. France, Glenn's adopted home, hardly any ethnic minorities at the top. Of course, the biggest contrast this month is UK elected Rishi Sunak, or the Tory MPs put him on the top post or the top run, whilst Italy elected Giorgia Meloni, an admirer of Mussolini. So without further ado, Glenn, what do you think? What is the implication of Rishi being the top man?
I struggle with my reactions to what's happening in ever less Great Britain now. because I mean, does it matter more than what happens in Iceland almost? You know, for me, the great event is that England has committed suicide in recent years, and
They're still active in Ukraine, very active.
They're playing a very important role. I mean, they don't, you know, the momentum of power doesn't cease instantaneously. But I think that they have progressively made the wrong decisions, and I understand why someone from the north of England, say, would have been a Brexiteer, would have supported leaving the European Union. I think it's just as I understand the supporters of Donald Trump in the United States, but it is profoundly self-destructive long term, or at the very least antithetical to the stated ideals of both Great Britain and the United States, respectively. And so,
I mean, Adrian Wooldridge of Bloomberg takes the view that Sunak regards Europe as a hidebound backwater in a world increasingly dominated by Asian giants and American dynamism. And of course, he married.
Well, that may be true.
But he married the daughter of Narayan Murthy, one of India's software billionaires.
I think that may be true, but then to decide that the card one must play is to turn Great Britain into Singapore is probably not the best option that you should pursue. Singapore would much rather have been Great Britain and the EU with respect to power and influence and safety from any other economic, financial, political, cultural perspective than having to be dependent on the brilliance of Lee Kuan Yew dealing with China or maneuvering America to protect it from protect its independence. So to me, the great issue is England's visceral response, influenced by the Russian intelligence to the stresses of the globalized, multicultural world and society that Great Britain's become. So you can argue that Sunak is a triumph of an emerging society, and I think there's truth to that. But I find the Tory party, for that matter, the Labour Party too, utterly discredited with their policies. And to the extent that he repudiates them, this is a sign of good sense. But he nonetheless is largely plays a substantial role in leading Great Britain to its progressive irrelevancy as an international power. It just is shocking to me. So I have trouble marshaling much enthusiasm for all his brilliance and rationality, which he has a great deal when he chooses to exercise them rather than just political expedience.
I mean, what is important is that Rishi is 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth, you have David Cameron resigning after Brexit, going prematurely. Then you have Theresa May, and she struggled to control the infighting within her party and eventually had to leave. Then you had Boris Johnson, whom the membership supported wholeheartedly, and he won a historic re-election, massive re-election. And then, of course,
well, which was no credit to him or to the Tories. It was a repudiation of the lunacy of the Labour Party.
Well, maybe, but he did win the elections. He did have a mandate, Glenn. Peter might disagree. Peter likes Jeremy Corbyn, so we have different perspectives.
I'll leave to Peter the defense of Jeremy Corbyn and their Labour Party's policies.
Yeah, but the point is, he did win a historic mandate, and the red wall of the North crumbled. And then, of course, Boris had to go because of Partygate, too many scandals, too much champagne, too much wine, too much schmoozing around, if not smooching around, whilst the rest of the country was in lockdown. And then, of course, we had a very short-lived premiership of Liz Truss, was damned by The Economist as having the shelf life of a lettuce. And now we have Rishi Sunak, and he has, shall we say, very, very poor cards to play.
It
There's a
does.
big deficit. There's a cost of living crisis going on. Inflation is going up thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a huge hole in the British budget. Taxes will have to go up. Government spending will have to go down. Rishi is on record saying that he'd like government spending to be 37% of the GDP. Right now, British spending as a percentage of GDP is
Probably 44.
It's 44.6 in 21-22. It was 51.6 in 2020-21. So
well,
that is going to cause a lot of social strains. And yes,
absolutely.
And yes,
absolutely.
He's trying to create a party of Tory unity, not national unity.
Yeah,
but
this is the dilemma. This is why I'm disdainful of the Tories to a large extent. It's what do they represent? They represent an alliance with the United States. That's one way that Great Britain will maintain its influence and greatness. Okay.
Junior partnership. I thought that was the operative word for you chaps.
We like the word junior, sure. No, I mean that's coherent, fine. And then they oppose their government, the size of the government, and they want low taxes. They're essentially Republicans with an English accent. So okay,
no, they keep the NHS, unlike the Republicans.
Well, so they
may underfund it, but they keep the NHS.
But they refuse to fund it. It's always been chronically either poorly managed, but more likely just underfunded given how it's structured. And so, okay, that's coherent. But then you get to the same point that my father made in local politics 50 years ago. He said to me, "So you can be against taxes, fine, but then where do you wish to cut? And do you want to cut the NHS, or do you want to cut your military budget? Do you want to cut supports for highway construction or for education? You have to choose." And the Tories and the Republicans always present the candy, the handout of low taxes and everyone in independence or individual freedoms, while avoiding because it will get them thrown out of office, the cuts that implies, or sincerely embracing them, which is intellectually coherent, but leads to near revolution because people don't want to see their pensions cut and the National Health Service cut. And that's the substance and the dilemma that Sunak faces, and the policies that his party has led to. And so I have zero sympathy whatsoever.
Yeah, but just to crystallize the issue, Liz Truss promised the moon. She said you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have tax cuts and more spending. The markets were spooked. The Bank of England had to intervene. The pound crashed. Eventually, she had to go. Rishi, during his campaign, to be fair to him, said this was fairy tale economics. Mm-hmm. And he did make a point that taxes would have to go up, spending would have to go down, the budget would have to be balanced. So in a way, he's been brought in because he predicted that the economy would implode, and it did implode. And he is almost in a way a technocrat brought in like Mario Draghi to balance the books in 2 years and basically to reassure the markets. So in that sense, he's as much a prime minister of financial markets. He's as much a prime minister of Goldman Sachs, the Children's Investment Fund, and of course, the city, as he is of the Tory party.
Yeah, yes. Oh, yes. It's all rational, all necessary, all unavoidable, and he'll do it, and he may be relatively successful, but okay, good. England is still now a rock off the coast of Europe someplace.
Well, and England is also a country now where the office held by Winston Churchill is now occupied by Rishi Sunak. The
jewel in the crown now holds the crown.
Exactly, HINDOO, as he used to spell it back in the day. And on that note, we've run out of time. It's been wonderful having all of you here. Fair Observer exclusive, FO exclusive will be back next month with the top 3 issues of November. Make sure you tune in. We'll look forward to seeing all of you and to answering all of your questions. All the best. Have a lovely November ahead. May you stay warm.
Yes.